Okay, thank you, Brian, and thank you for having me. This has been really an interesting experience hearing so many people talking about science from so many different perspectives. Um, my background is in information science, and that can explain why I look at science through documents, because that's what I've been looking at. I look at data, information, and documents. And because a lot of the science requires communication, we do publish it. So, of course, there is a lot that we miss knowing about science if we focus on documents. But the idea is what can be learned about science as this complex, multi-layer social technical system if we look at the documents. So today I'm going to cover, it may seem a lot, but these are the themes that cover different areas of what's happening with science today. So, and I call it a changing landscape of knowledge production because there have been a lot of things that have been changing at different paces, but they all have been happening. And the first one is the increased pressures on productivity that, as a consequence, have what I'll show later or soon, growth in the publications. Then there is this push for interdisciplinarity. There is shift towards team science. And then we have this very large number then of practitioners who are trying to move the scientific frontiers forward. So let's start with science and how it grows. So if you look at the growth of publications, so the source for this particular slide is Complete Web of Science. So it includes like everything that they index, but this is by no means everything that has been published. Like this is just a subset, and some say small subset of what we are producing. So in 2010, we are up to 1.5 million a year articles, right? That's where we are. If you look at these slides, and it's interesting that not just these slides, but early researchers who looked at this topic, and Price, DeSola Price, physicist and historian of science, who first looked at documents as networks, was the one who talked about science growing exponentially. And now in literature, you can actually find sentences that say science grows exponentially. And for some reason, I started wondering, but how do we define science? And what is science? And can it grow exponentially? And what does it even mean? So does the exponential growth of science means that our knowledge is growing exponentially? And is science knowledge or is science something else? So I came to the conclusion that it probably might not be possible that it's growing exponentially. It's just that for us, science is publications, right? So that's how we measure it. Because if we say science is growing exponentially, and what we do, we measure publications, then science equals publications, right? Implicitly, even more, publications equal knowledge, and that may or may not be true. So the idea is, hopefully it's true. So the idea is then to look at, is there any other method that would be somewhat better approximation to science as a body of knowledge? And this is not perfect by any means because no measure is perfect. But the idea is, okay, what's out there in the documents that we can measure that can serve as a proxy for knowledge? And titles came as something that all of the articles had, even historically, like article as a genre has changed a lot. Like it didn't look the same through time, but if you look back, as soon as it showed up, it had titles. So can we use then titles somehow to measure knowledge? And for that, you need to extract what I call concepts. And it's tricky, and it's not that clean. And the idea is to use something close to n-grams that were noticed, mentioned this morning. But the idea is if you look, lots of the existing programs, they can extract either single words or bigrams or trigrams, but the idea is, okay, but we don't communicate only in one word, or we don't communicate only in two-word phrases and three-word phrases. Like we use a variety of phrases. And can we find a relatively simple method to then extract the phrases? And it seems to be something that works, and that would give us a measure of the territory that science covers, right? Do we have a lot of people focusing on a small number of topics or expanding? And if you measure science that way, this is what you get. So yes, we are including more and more concepts, but they are growing more linearly, which is, I think, closer to our notions how science has moved. And this particular measure that I use to answer this kind of more personal pondering actually turned out to be very useful as a thing that I could use to correlate them to other things when I wanted to measure different things in terms of the contribution to the science. This growth, being linear or exponential, it's still huge, even if it's linear, has led to a great specialization in science. And we don't know, there are myriads of fields and subfields and areas and topics and so on. And then it becomes increasingly difficult for individuals to cover that whole territory. But we know that at the same time, the problems that have remained to be answered are the ones that require us to cut across. And you can go into calls by funding agencies, or you can even go to universities now have grand challenging, right? And the idea is that you need people who really cross. It's not that you need two biologists. Well, we need that too. But you need a biologist and a historian and an engineer, right? It's that type of diversity that we are talking about. So the idea is, well, can we measure? Are we there yet? Or how far are we? How much do we engage in that type of crossover? And to look at that, this is the work that it's currently being written up by my collaborators, Filippo Radicchi from Indiana University and John Walsh from Georgia Tech. And we looked at the interdisciplinarity as an input measure, right? So we take all of the references and we don't look at journals as quality, which we could have, but we looked at all of the individual articles which are assigned these broad areas, and then we look how diverse they are. Do they really literally draw from far across? And you can see what the fields are. And of course, like in everything in science, these measures are field dependent. So fields really behave differently. And it turns out that the area that jumps the most is actually agriculture at the moment, followed by psychology. So those of you who are here, and there are lots of psychologists, you are doing this a lot, much more than other people. Geosciences, computers, and people who engage in that list are humanities, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. But one thing that struck me is, while there are groups that engage in this a lot, most of the research is not doing that. So what's common for all 14 areas is that between 18 to 90% of all of the research is just within that broad area, right? So we are not doing a lot of that. Like in the whole science, we are doing just 20% of everything we are doing is actually doing what we believe collectively that should be done. And the idea is, but there is kind of hope, because if you look at this, is again looking at whole web of science, it seems that we are picking up the pace, right? So if you look very early on, but the early data, I have to say, should be taken with a caveat, because reference practices were different. The way the data is indexed is different. So yes, it grew faster, but it might be the artifact of the data I'm using. But starting from the 50s and 60s, data is really much richer, and we are seeing that starting 2000, we are picking up the pace, right? So we are doing more of this quicker, it's growing, but again, we are still at the 20%. If you want to see who are the champions, psychology is doing the greatest. This is who made the biggest move, so who gained a lot, it was psychology, right? So they had the biggest increase in this type of research. And the ones who are doing this the least are engineering, astronomy, medicine, and biology. And I'm a little bit surprised with some of those, because some of the grand challenges are really in these areas. So it may be interesting why we are not seeing, at least in published literature, more of that. So with this, I want to leave what's the part of the talk that talks more about science as this knowledge creation enterprise, and move more as science is a social activity, right? So how do we do it, right? This is what we do, and this is how do we engage then collectively doing this? And we've heard, all of you have heard, or before, and in these 3 days, a lot about science being a team effort, or science as a team effort. And I think science is, like there is no science as, like science is a team effort today. We've reached that point. But then the question is, and the thing that comes up, and that came up a lot, the way we measure how collaborative we are is by looking at the mean or median, right? So we say, okay, the teams are getting larger, and yes, we calculate the mean, and the mean size of the team is larger. There is a caveat in this, because when we say that just the mean is getting larger, that means that we assume that the distribution is the same. The only thing that changed is they just grew, right? Like the processes are the same, like it's just somehow we are doing this increase without the processes being different. However, when you look historically, that's not at all what happened. Historically, our collaboration was a Poissonian distribution, right? It didn't really, there wasn't the same processes that were driving the team formation. Teams were really drawn from probably closer collaborates, a few of them. And what we see now is this power law tail. And how did we get from here to here? And you may say, wait a minute, but this is just in astronomy, right? And you are now saying that where we had 90%, and in astronomy, it's interesting, 90% of all of the papers in astronomy in 1960 were single author papers. And now individual authors less than 10%, and average team is seven people, right? So I think that in itself is interesting, but physics, like this is even more surprising. This is what physics looked like in 41 to 45. It really looked pretty much the same as astronomy, right? The largest team in physics had 8 people. Like that was their big team science back in 41, 45. But we see the same processes. So the question was, well, but what is happening? And I did the agent-based model in a way to see how this works. And the model was able to reproduce this. And the way it happens is you have an author or a researcher come to the field, and they form the core team, what they call the core team. And the core team can be a single author team, right? They can be their own team. Or they can enlist 2 or 3 people, up to 10. So see, like they are drawing from the Poissonian distribution. And then I allow that these teams really cannot answer certain questions on their own. They need to enlist other people. Other people may have instruments, they have data, they have resources, they have something that they need in order to engage in certain types of problems. So what they do is they team with other core teams. So actually the large teams are the results of these core teams forming and not individuals, right? It's the interactions between these small teams. And how do they grow so big? It's the cumulative advantage, and it's based on productivity. So it's not the largest teams that grow the fastest, it's the most productive teams that picked up more people. So what happened was they were very productive, so they amassed more people, but see now, they are at a different pace. So now they have more people, so they're even more productive. And that's why you see these really high inequalities. If you do this, you can actually see, and this is, when this was published, it was contemporary. So this was published in 2014. So looking at 2010 was close to the data, but this was what different fields look like. So this is mathematics in 2010. It's pretty much where physics and astronomy were a few years ago. And you can see that this is ecology and psychology. So they are developing the power law, they're picking up, but they are nowhere near where, but they are going in that direction. So it's kind of like evolution. Like you can see when you look at these different fields, you can see that they're almost at the different levels of the evolution towards this like tail-driven distribution. But how you can, by looking then at this, so if you now think that there are these core teams and the extended teams, but then you want to see what is the relative contribution of them to science, right? Do they equally contribute? Are these large teams now really driving what's happening? And you can do an analytical explanation of this, and you can see that there are actually 3 types of teams. The first one are core teams, and they are what are responsible for this. And actually, this is the majority of scientists. I mean, this is 80% of people engaged in the core team activity, meaning in the small teams, right? Most of the people work in small teams most of the time. And then there were these large teams that I call extended team. But something happened here. The model couldn't be reproduced just with these 2. And that's when the norms come in. I had to introduce something called core plus 1, because it happened that there was a huge influx of 2 author teams, and most of those were an entering author and an existing author. So we have student-faculty pairs. So it became a norm that faculty would start publishing papers with students, which wasn't obviously before. So then, knowing this, if you want to know what, for example, this is astronomy, what it looks like, if you just look at the mean, you would say, well, this is how it grows. But actually, you can see that the core teams are also growing, but they are adding only 1 or 2 people. They're still very, very small, but the extended teams are really what's driving that mean. How much they contribute to astronomy? Pretty much the same. So extended teams that were 4 people in the past, did 70% of astronomy, and they continue to do that. They're just larger, right? So they don't dominate how much astronomy is being done, but they are just larger. If you wonder, and this is just showing how many of those are. If you wonder what the non-collaborative, but this is not in any negative way, field looks like, this is what mathematics looks like. So core teams and all teams are the same. This is the extended team in mathematics. It goes all the way to 3, right? So they're large teams. Standard core teams are going down, but you know who is taking over, core plus 1. So in mathematics, we are seeing also changes in norms. And you can see where it starts late 70s and then 80s and 90s, and now, in the 2000s, you see that's more of a norm. If you look back in the astronomy, you can see that in astronomy, that kind of became a norm in the 70s. So if you look at this decomposition, you can see when it became a norm, for example, for these mostly student-faculty pairs to collaborate. So that's about the teams. But then, so the small teams really serve as the foundation or the seed for the larger teams. But is that their only role? Do they contribute intellectually? What do they do? And this is the research that actually is complementary to what James was talking yesterday about how small teams are disruptive. And what this shows is it's not only that they are disruptive, but they are actually the ones who cover the whole cognitive territory. Everything that's done in astronomy is pretty much done by single authors and two author teams, both in physics and astronomy. And these very large teams are really a small subset of what's being done. They work only on a very small subset of topics. So if you combine that to James's findings, well, it does mean that they kind of explore, and you can see this also here. It's the inverse, right? So the smallest teams, which are the 1 and 2 author teams, cover everything in astronomy and physics, and in biomedicine, which is really interesting. So biomedicine here is whole PubMed, 20 million PubMed articles here. So this one, where majority of ideas are covered are in the teams of 3 to 5 authors. And that may be the nature of the research because they work in labs, they need that many people. What can a single author do in biomedical field? I'm not sure, probably not as much as 3 to 5, right? But here, because they have also strong theoretical components here, you can see that they still work on most of the topics. So what that means is, and it may have implications for funding, if we put all our resources into funding these very large efforts, we will have a lot of the topics to completely drop. And I tested, the large teams do not cover any unique topic. All of the topics that are covered are also covered in small teams. So they don't work on anything unique in terms of the concepts. So if we put all of our resources in large teams, we may be losing a lot of the diversity or lots of the exploration of new ideas, right? And that may actually have consequences for the diversity. I'm going now back to the interdisciplinarity part, which I'm working with Filippo and John. And you may see, well, but who is doing better interdisciplinary-wise? And it would, everything here, it depends on a field, right? But what's interesting, that the baseline here is a single author. So the idea is, okay, how interdisciplinary a single individual could be, right? Are more people more or less interdisciplinary than one person? And we can see that for a lot of the fields, it's true, but they're sometimes they're not doing that better than individuals in terms of interdisciplinarity. And in physics and astronomy, they're actually doing worse. They are less interdisciplinary than individuals. And it may make sense because these are very large focused efforts on a single theme, right? So like it's high energy physics, like maybe they're probably not interdisciplinary, and that's what we are seeing. So I'm now going to shift to the last part, which is how does all of these affect role of the researchers and their overall careers? And if one looks at the careers, oftentimes we, again, focus, or historically, people have focused on the success measured as citations or awards, and that keeps us focused more on what was asked, I think, early on, these high achievers. Like we focus only on people who are doing good. But my question is, okay, but can we use documents, again, as a proxy to cast a wider net, right? To see what is maybe happening to the larger group of people, keeping in mind these things. So actually, what drove this part of research, and this research has also been done with Filippo and John, and we were thinking, okay, if we follow the notion that the teams are really there because of the need for division of labor and standardization, then that should maybe change what people do when they actually engage in these activities. The second thing that is driving here has to do with this interplay between education and our notions, or how education still works. I think the way we educate is still based on the so-called craft principle or craft model, where you have an apprentice and you reproduce that apprentice to be the next you, right? So like that's what we are working on still, based on the courses we offer and what we make people do in the research. But everything says that actually the science is kind of maybe moving towards the more bureaucratic industrial principles, right? There is a higher division, and people may be engaged in more specialized roles that are critical for science, but they are different, right? So they are not the same. And again, this is nothing new. Like this was something that was written back in the 60s and 70s. Like people are saying, okay, we are moving more towards like leaving craft-based model and really moving towards large labs that are more like bureaucratized. And finally, and this is especially true in the US, we have this really high tension between the research production and teaching functions of the faculty. And teaching here, I mean mentoring, right? So you as a mentor, your goal would be to let your student learn everything they need, right? So let them explore all of the areas. That will be good for them to be future PIs, right? Is that good for you when you have in half an hour to submit the next thing? No, you want people who are really good at something to do something quickly, right? Because they're good at that. So there is this notion of like, you need to produce more quicker, and for that, you need people to specialize. That's what they're good at. But for maybe individuals, it may be better to explore. And what that leads when you look at what happens in the roles that people play on papers. So again, this is just looking at the papers and authorship roles, and we looked at the three fields, astronomy, ecology, and robotics. And I have to say, this needs to be done where you know you can assess the roles in the field, in a field based on the authorship practices, right? So if the first author is the one who did most of the work, you can do this to assess who the lead author was. Or the first, last, or the corresponding, and we did a lot of that. And in all three fields, we could establish those things. And you know what's happening? We are having a huge rise of people who never led a paper. So, and we allowed that they could have led a paper anytime in their career. So it's not now. Like we just follow these people, we see when they started and when they left, and then we say, okay, did they ever wrote a paper as a lead author? And now around 70% of all of the people who are actually contributing to science never led anything. And that means they're crucial. Like their contributions are crucial for the how science is done today. Well, one may say, yeah, but what about that undergrad who just came as RU and then he left or she left after that summer? And there's a technical term for that in this area of research introduced again by the Sola Prize, who call these people transients. So people who just published once and leave, like they're called transients. And if you exclude those, it drops, right? So we see that the percentages, but it's not explaining the whole phenomenon. We still have a very large people who are doing a lot, and yet they are not leading, right? So they have somewhat different roles. Well, you can see then, but okay, so how that pans out for their careers? Not good. And I think it has to do with what Paula just said, which is there are no long-term, especially in the US, there are no long-term stable positions for these people, right? We don't have a research scientist position where one is hired and can spend 30 years really helping others do that. We do that a lot through grad students and postdoc or more people who come and leave, right? And if you look then, and we performed the hazard probability function, so we said, okay, if you're a lead author, how likely, if you're a lead author, well, okay, there is a good news and bad news. Good news is if you're a lead author, you have higher chances of surviving, but chances are still kind of low. And it also doesn't mean, like this shows that the leaky pipeline model, which is based on leaving at just particular points in the career, is not observed in this data. It may be happening, but we are not seeing really big spikes in leaves after 5 years or 7 years. It seems that people keep leaking throughout, like they keep leaving throughout. Supporting authors are, they on average do have shorter careers, but some of them actually manage to have very long careers, up to 20 years, but that is rare. And they are at a much higher hazard of leaving quicker than the lead authors. So again, this was done on 3 fields as a starting point. And you may be wondering, like, why these 3 fields? Well, as you have seen, astronomy is a great case study for lots of these things because it has teams of like from like this very large science, now 500 people working, to individual theoreticians. It's very good to define, like 80% of all of their publications are published in just 6 journals. So like it's a really kind of good test bed for lots of these. Ecology seemed like a good idea which I used before for other studies as an example of bioscience, but and robotics, we wanted to do more of an engineering type of field, right? So these were supposed to be exemplars of different types of science that is being done. But what's interesting is that regardless of the type of science, we do see similar trends, right? That people are leaving fields or stop publishing much quicker. So having said that, this was like a I don't know, a tour force through a bunch of stuff that in my mind kind of are connected but I think they need more connection in terms of, given that science is this complex multi-layer system, the problem is that the things that are happening at the level of individuals or what's good for individuals may not really be best for the teams, which are also parts of the ecology, right? They're a different layer. And then what may be good for one team or two may not be for the field, and it may not be good for sciences at all. And then we have this competing interest, and then we have institutions and disciplines on the part of that, and we have teaching. So this is just what this was, my attempt to slice and actually see what's happening at different levels. But ideally, one wants to combine this and model and see what happens with the perturbation at one level, like how that plays out across the levels. Because there are feedback loops. I mean, then it becomes very complicated, and you cannot just simply tweak one thing without thinking what it does to the whole system. And if anything, this shows that the system is very complex. It's really moving, and all of the indicators that the system is moving much faster in changing in all of these directions. So with that, I'll leave, and if you have any questions.
Wow, that was amazing. Really incredibly comprehensive view of the world. So I'm just really intrigued by your approach to building libraries of concepts.
Mm-hmm.
So you said you were extracting phrases.
Yes.
Was that noun phrases or verb phrases?
No, actually it was everything. So it's a very simple method. So I used punctuation as breakers, and then I use stop words, which are of, and so every time I encounter a punctuation or punctuation mark or a stop word, that's where I break the title. So if you break the title that way, you keep the phrases of all of the sizes. It's not perfect, but actually it provides a fairly good first approximation. Yes.
And so the follow-on, just quick question is, does that, if you were to compare that breakdown of the concepts to existing hierarchies of concepts and ontologies within each subject, could that give you a kind of a sense of which aspects of the field are more likely to attract more authors, or kind of be able to evaluate the complexity and dependency between concepts?
Okay, and that's a great question. And maybe it's one of those, the cobbler's shoes. So because I come, and it's not a cobbler's shoes, I come from information science, and then I'm really distrustful of using ontologies or classifiers. And it's not because they're not well done, but they take because I constructed some, and they are enormously complex, and they move very slowly. So they are really looking at the past, and they really depend on a lot of the collective decisions, which terms make it to the ontologies and which not. And also the way they are assigned depends on not just the authors, but sometimes, for example, indexers are told you need to use 3 terms, period, or 3 keywords, regardless of. So I haven't been using it, but I think it's a great idea to maybe look at how quickly those ontologies or classified systems grew and how quickly these grew, and that can give some comparison. So yeah, I could totally look into that. Thank you.
Hi, Staša. Well, I'm Marta, the physicist / engineer. Thanks. I think it's great. I wanted to ask you about interdisciplinarity. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I don't know, for a while it was this idea like, well, the more interdisciplinary you get, the more impact your research is going to get, the more complex problems you're going to be able to tackle, so on and so forth. But maybe I zoned out and I didn't quite understand what measure of interdisciplinarity you are using. But I was more curious about the fact whether you think that this should be something that doesn't change in time. Because as science grows and it gets more specialized, right, there are more subfields within the fields. And within physics, for instance, then you have, before maybe you could argue that somebody collaborating between physics and biology was interdisciplinary, but now maybe somebody working on network science and fluid mechanics is already interdisciplinary because they are really like as far away as those two were at the time, right? So I was wondering whether you are considering any of this and what impact it would have.
Yes, so no, definitely. So your level of granularity of defining the field definitely is driving the results, right? So, and you will find more interdisciplinarity the more granular you get, right? Precisely because of all of these specializations. However, the key here was this driving force that we need this interdisciplinarity that really spans wide areas. So here we define 14 very broad areas, like so all physics is together, like all of biology is together, right? So the idea is, do people really jump from physics to social science, right? Or how much of those larger leaps they do, right? So we wanted to cover the large leaps, and we did that by looking at these very broad areas. And even they changed in time, but it does seem that there aren't as many these big jumps as maybe we would like to see in order to answer some of the problems, yeah. And it was based on the references, so each reference is given a broad field, and then we'll look at the composition of the references, how interdisciplinary are the references. differences. But it's a great question. And yes, these measures, any measures of interdisciplinarity, are really sensitive to the granularity of how you define what you are looking for. So you can find a lot of it, or you can find very little. That's true. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Daniele Fanelli, on the School of Economics. I was curious a little bit on the same, along the same lines. I understand the difficulties and the necessities to sort of aggregate the data at some rather coarse level of granularity. But to what extent, in your impression, a sort of naive hierarchy of the sciences order would explain some of the patterns you observe? And when I say hierarchy of the sciences, I mean sort of a Simonton kind of way from, let's say, physics to chemistry to biology up. For example, in interdisciplinarity, would it be plausible to hypothesize that a discipline at the top of the hierarchy has sort of more room at the bottom, as it were, to collaborate than the other way around? Just as a...
That's an interesting one to see. It's like, so what is the collaborative capacity of fields because they are more powerful or have more freedom? That's an interesting one. We haven't looked, but that could be. Do you have a good? I know that Ian was talking about the hierarchies, but are there really good like ways that this has been done on this data that can be just applied or just one?
Well,
Anyway,
we can talk more. There is definitely quite a bit of a literature. I was also thinking, not just in terms, since I'm alone, I can keep talking.
Yeah.
This time. No, so interestingly, yeah, the sociological aspects is plausible as well. But even just technically, and I was thinking psychology would have more scope to collaborate with ecology, biology, genetics. It could weigh down even physics. Whereas the other way around, there's obviously some physics that might collaborate with biologists or sociologists, but there's a lot of physics that can only refer to other physics. So there's an asymmetry in scope, if you see what I mean.
It is, and that is true. So, and a clarification, because what we looked here was more what knowledge they draw from, but it would be interesting when you apply that to individuals to see how much it's driven by these differences in sizes and how they do. That would be very interesting. Yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you.